As for the trucks, they came as these ant-like people came out with picks and shovels and knocked the boulders around and filled it in with sand and with clay, and the trucks then were able to roll. I watched it happen, and then I heard the air raid alarm. American planes were coming back. They took their knives out, they cut the palmetto leaves, they separated the boats, they shoved them back into the rushes along the banks. I watched our planes come, dip down and look. No bridge there, they said. Off our planes went. Out came the sampans. On went the delivery system. These are a remarkable people. Then I understood what they had done at Dien Bien Phu. General Giap, a brilliant strategist, had invented the Legion of Porters. They carried it on their backs. They carried it by canoe. They carried it by sampan. They got the supplies through. And the French knew that the jig was up. And we went to Geneva. This is one of the most important parts of the story. Detail, for it is so very important what happened in Geneva. We are there to stop an aggression. We are there for self-determination. Well, if we are, perhaps we ought to be there. If it is an aggression against freedom from a valiant people whom we were supporting, then we should be there. But suppose it wasn't an aggression. Suppose it wasn't for self-determination, then we really oughtn't to be there. So really the crux of the matter is, how did we get in? That's where the Geneva Treaty. Shortly, I will answer your questions to the best of my ability. Perhaps now, you, and for yourself, not for me, to make a point, not to embarrass anybody, but an important point. I'd like an honest show of hands, a truthful answer. Here have read the full text of the Geneva Treaty of 1954. Full text, how many? Well, what would you say? What would all of you say if I told you it wasn't 1,000 pages? It's 1,000 words. 2.5 pages. That's not too much for you to read. That's not too much for your papers to print. Or for your commentators on radio and television to tell you about. It's a very short and a vital document. Let me describe the document to you and the situation obtaining at that moment. When Dien Bien Phu fell, the Viets controlled North Vietnam. More than that, and very importantly, the Viet armies controlled more than half of what is now called South Vietnam. When the French sued for peace, the Russians and the Chinese, listen to this, the Russians and the Chinese said to Ho Chi Minh, look here, in the South, lay down their arms, move north of the 17th parallel, accept the principle of elections. The Americans are hung up about elections. Give them elections. Now, why should the Chinese tell them that? They were very worried that America might intervene. And indeed, and all of the men here know this, but the women are all too young, so for the sake of the women, I will recall what happened in 1954. The French appealed to us to save the garrison at Dien Bien Phu by an airstrike. And there was a great debate in this country. One man stood up and said, we must help the French. We must send our boys in. He was the Vice President of the United States, Richard M. Nixon. I'll say one thing about Nixon. He is consistent. He's never been right, but he's consistent. Mr. Nixon proposed sending American men in April 1954 at a convention of the Associated Press editors. Mr. Eisenhower, alarmed by the situation, called in his principal aides and said to his foreign secretary, Mr. Dulles, have you consulted our allies? Those were the days when American presidents used to consult with their allies. And Foster said no, he hadn't done that, and Eisenhower said, I'd better write to Churchill and see what he thinks. So he wrote to Churchill, and Churchill wrote back and said, forget it. You ought to read Churchill's letter. It's in the book. Churchill said the war is lost. It's been fought for 8 years. It's a colonial war. It makes no sense. The British, we British, will not go along with you. Eisenhower was very impressed by that. He then called in the Senate leader. Those were the days when the President of the United States used to talk with the Senate leaders. And he said to the Senate leader, what do you think? And the Senate leader said, forget it. Churchill's against it. The war is lost. It's ridiculous. We just gladly got out of Korea. We're not going to go into Korea. That's the worst place in the world to go, Vietnam, said he. And I'll give you one guess as to the name of the Senate leader. Lyndon B. Johnson. Yes, Mr. Johnson. Read his a very interesting statement that he made to Eisenhower. And so Eisenhower decided not to, and on the 12th of February and the 5th of March, he made a speech telling the American people we were not going to go into Dien Bien Phu. Now, the Russians and Chinese were watching this debate and very nervous about it. They didn't know whether the Americans would change their minds. They said, oh, they're very unstable people, the Americans. We didn't think they were going to go into Korea as they came in. So look, please, give them elections. They're crazy about elections, and you'll win them anyway. Everybody knew it. Eisenhower knew it. Read Eisenhower's memoirs, Mandate for Change. He says on page 262 that he never met anybody knowledgeable who had the thought that if elections were held, Ho Chi Minh would win by 80%. That's why we didn't want the elections to be held. You see, we Americans are in favor of free elections on consideration that our side's going to win. So we decided not to hold the elections. Now, how did we get away with that? Well, Godin Gem. Who was Godin Gem? Godin Gem was a Catholic Mandarin who wouldn't work for the French, went into exile, was brought to this country by the Maryknoll missionaries. They took him to Ossining, New York. Right city, but wrong institution. They then brought him into New York to introduce him to Cardinal Spellman, and Cardinal Spellman said he was pleased to see this Catholic ready to fight for freedom, and that the Archdiocese would support him. Godin Gem began working with the American Friends of Vietnam Lobby, among them very prominent a professor from this neighborhood called Wesley Fishel of Michigan State. Godin Gem didn't stay there long. He wasn't happy in Ossining. Who's happy in Ossining? You know, hardly anybody. He was a French culture, so he went to Belgium. And there he stayed until the end of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, when we needed somebody to put into power. So the French came to Postadolus and said, figuring he'd like him because he was a Catholic, the French foreign minister at that time described Postadolus as the first card-carrying Christian that he'd ever met. And Foster said, fine, I'll back him. Of course, it was a slight fact generally overlooked by everybody. But they sent Godin Gem to Saigon. Now remember, he wasn't elected to anything. He was put in power. Do you know by whom? Our old friend, Emperor Bao Dai. Emperor Bao Dai, remember, abdicated his throne and served Ho Chi Minh? But he didn't like it very much in Hanoi under the communists. He didn't get any opium. He didn't get any white Western virgins or any of the things that emperors of Indochina expect to have. So he fled to Hong Kong and the French Riviera, where the French then resurrected him and brought him back as emperor after his abdication. He appointed Godin Gem, and we said to Godin Gem, get in there, boy, we'll back you. This is what is known as the defense of freedom and self-determination of the people of Vietnam. And every word I tell you, absurd as this may sound, is true and part of the historical record. And Godin Gem arose and said, I will not hold elections. You can't hold elections in a communist country, said he. And we said, bravo, you're right. And that is true. But why didn't we say that in the Geneva Treaty? No, we didn't. We agreed in the Geneva Treaty to hold the elections. Why? We wanted to get the communists out of the South. And we made a contract with them. Get out of the South, go north of the 17th parallel temporarily, just for 2 years, and we'll give you elections to reunify the country. We broke the contract. Many of you present are businessmen. You know when you break one part of the contract, the whole contract goes. We offered them free elections in return for leaving their villages and to await elections during a period of calm. We didn't give them the elections. So what did they do? They came back to their villages. Southern boys, every one of them, Southerners, went home, picked up the guns they had laid down, and fought again for their country. This is what Mr. Rusk calls an aggression. That is not an aggression. They had every right, legal, moral, and duty of a man to go back to fight for his country. The French had been defeated. Remember, it was a war of independence against the French Empire. There was nobody else involved. Many Americans forget. I mean, it is partisans. Remember, 1946 it broke out. 46, 47, 48, 49. All during those years, there was no Red China. Red China didn't exist. It only came into existence in January 1950 after Mao had defeated Chiang Kai-shek. So clearly it was not just communism, but a nationalist against the French Empire. What's wrong with the phrase war of national liberation that we Americans should shy from it? Wasn't our country born of a war? Is it only because Marshal Lin Piao used this word after hundreds of other people used it that it became a bad word? If the Chinese came out in favor of motherhood, would we throw mud at mothers? I regret that this phrase, national liberation, which is meaningful to me, has been distorted by Lin Biao, but I won't oppose it for that reason. Ho fought alone before the Chinese existed. Then when the Chinese did exist, they recognized him and helped them. Mr. Atchison and Mr. Rusk told us that proves that Ho is a servant of communism. What nonsense. I had an argument with this at Gettysburg Farm, the farm of my old boss, General Eisenhower. In 1964, we were celebrating the 20th anniversary of the liberation of Paris. And Eisenhower said to me, Shoenbrun, what in the world's gotten into you? Why, my friends tell me you're going up and down this country making speeches denouncing us in Vietnam. I said, yes, sir, I am. Well, he says, you know Ho Chi Minh is a servant of the Russians and the Chinese? Just look, they're giving him everything he's got, all of his supplies. And I looked at him and I said, General, I was one of your liaison officers to General de Gaulle. The uniform he wore, you gave him. His troop pay, every gun and bullet, you gave General de Gaulle. Tell me, sir, when did you ever control General de Gaulle? Supplies control. He was fighting for independence, and we should have let it go at that. I regret the fact that there were no Democrats who could arrive in Vietnam to hold more deal. And I remember before the ink was dry on the Geneva Treaty that we violated it by the Cito Treaty. The Cito Treaty was written within 75 days of the Geneva Treaty. Now, the Geneva Treaty provided, and if you read this treaty, I hope you will, the only word used to describe the country is Vietnam. Never north, never south. It spoke about two zones of one country, Vietnam. The 17th parallel was described as a temporary military demarcation line, which in no case, shall be considered a political frontier or territorial line. It is as clear as words can be. There was no excuse whatsoever for then setting up a Cito Treaty and bringing South Vietnam as a chronicle state under Cito. That was a violation of the Geneva Treaty right there. It was a violation of the Charter of the United Nations. I recommend to you another book, an excellent book, only 84 pages, called Vietnam and International Law, by the Lawyers' Committee on Vietnam, drafted by 12 of America's leading jurists, including Professor Richard Falk, Milbank Professor of International Law at Princeton University, which will give you all the details, which I don't think there's time to go into tonight. But it seemed clear to me that the Geneva Treaty called for free elections, for the one country, Vietnam, to be reunified. It was violated by Ngo Dinh Diem with our support. We then, with Mr. Dulles' pactomania, tried to set up a Cito Treaty. The Cito Treaty, which Mr. Rusk told you yesterday, told Fulbright yesterday, was one of the articles committing us to the defense of Vietnam. It is not an article committing us. Read, I ask you, the Cito Treaty. Let me tell you what it provides. In case of subversion, every member of Cito, I quote, is obliged instantly to consult with one another, unquote. That's all, to consult. In case of attack by aggression by armed attack, each signatory alone should decide according to its own due constitutional process what steps it wishes to take. Not a commitment to go to war, a commitment to decide what you want to do. And read the testimony. Read the testimony in the book U.S. and Vietnam by Professors Kane and Lewis of Cornell University, in which Senator Green says to John Foster Dulles, sir, does this commit us to go to war? And Dulles replied, I quote, no, sir. This is an obligation for consultation. It is not an obligation for action. Read it. The testimony is there in the Senate. You will find this and other testimony tightly condensed for you in my own new book, which will appear shortly, on Vietnam. The record is clear for anybody who wants to see as to what happened. From then, Eisenhower sent a letter to Godin Diem and said, I will give you aid. Mr. Johnson says that Eisenhower thus committed ourselves. He did not. Read Eisenhower's letter. It is in your gentleman's book. It says, I will give you aid, quote, on condition that you carry out certain needed reforms. In other words, conditional upon economic and social reforms being carried out. Eisenhower knew perfectly well, and the results are seen today, that an absentee landlord government could never rally the people to fight behind them against the communists. 2% of the people of South Vietnam own 45% of the land of South Vietnam. That explains why the communists get their support, because when they take over territory, they distribute the land to them. Eisenhower thought that. It will come as no surprise to my fellow Americans to hear that they took our advice, our money, but not our advice. Lots of money. No reforms were carried out. But Eisenhower, a very cautious man, sent no American soldiers. Now, it's important for you to understand this, to remember it. Mr. Johnson has told you he is carrying out the policy of his predecessors. He is not. His predecessor, Eisenhower, refused to send troops to Vietnam. He kept them within the 800 provided by the Geneva Treaty. After Eisenhower, Kennedy came in, and he did escalate the risks, but again, very cautiously. Kennedy sent up to some 15,000 advisors. Now, everybody knew they were troops. They weren't advisors. But Kennedy had a reason for calling them advisors. He did not want to commit ourselves and our prestige by calling them troops. Furthermore, in his last public statement on my network, CBS News, September 3rd, 1963, President Kennedy had this to say. In the final analysis, it is their war. They must fight it, and they must win it. We can advise them. We can help them. But we cannot fight it for them. That is what President Kennedy said. That, indeed, is what President Johnson said in 1964. On the 12th of August in New York City. On the 29th of August in Fort Worth, Texas. On the 12th of October in Akron, Ohio, I was there covering the election. Some of you may remember it from the radio and television shows. Mr. Lyndon Johnson said, there are some who would have us go north, and some who would have us go south, and some who would have us send American boys 10,000 miles away to do what Asian boys should do for themselves, but I will not send American boys to do the job. That is why I say to you, as I began tonight by telling you I am not a dove, I now say to you, I am not a dissenter. I am loyal to American traditions. I'm loyal to the policy of Eisenhower, who wouldn't send troops, to the policy of Kennedy, who wouldn't send troops. I am loyal to the policy of Lyndon Johnson in August of 1964. I am not a dissenter. He is the great dissenter of the United States. How did we then get all the way over into this mess if we were able until then to keep out of it? Because of a crisis in Saigon. Diem was assassinated, and Big Mean, who killed him, came in. And Big Mean was kicked out and replaced by Little Con. And Little Con was kicked out and replaced by medium-sized Quad. And we went right down the line of rascals until we got to Marshal Key, who said the man he admires most in the 20th century is Adolf Hitler. These military fascists representing a landlord government were unable to rally the people. The communists were. Now, we can say that the Vietnamese people are wrong and foolish and terrible to prefer communism to something else. I suppose that we're right. But it's none of our business. It's their business. Besides, reality is different from ideology. The reality is that the Saigon government could not rally its troops, and its troops wouldn't fight. And Johnson got report after report saying, it's all over. The Viet Cong is wrapping up the ARVN battalion, and in 4 to 6 weeks' time, they will be in Saigon. Mr. Johnson had the option of coming to us and saying, I promised you I wouldn't send American boys to do what Asian boys should do for themselves, and I regret to tell you that the Asian boys are not doing it. I have therefore ordered today all Americans and dependents to leave Saigon. He could have said that. Oh, I think there would have been a 90-day wonder with Dirksen telling him what a soft on communist appeaser he was, and then 90 days later we'd have found some other issue to knock ourselves to pieces on. In any case, that was his electoral obligation and promise to us, but he didn't do it. He said to his military men, what can I do about it? And they said, why don't you bomb them, and they'll get so scared that it'll be all over. And so we began bombing in February 1965. And it didn't work. And the Army said, well, all we need is 50,000 more men and we can turn the tide. And Johnson gave them the 50,000 men, and they didn't turn the tide. Today, in March 1968, 3 years later, we have dropped more than 1 million tons of bombs on Vietnam by the Pentagon's latest communique. That's more tonnage of explosive than on all of Nazi Germany in all of World War II. And at the present rate of bombing, by the fall, we will have dropped more bombs on little Vietnam, the size of California, than on all of Germany and Japan together in all of World War II. With what results? When we began bombing, Mr. Rush discovered and charged that there were 400 North Vietnamese regulars in the South. Today, after 1 million tons of bombing, there are 70,000 North Vietnamese regulars. Today, Mr. Westmoreland wants 206,000 more of our fine young men. The same Westmoreland who came back in December and who said to us, I see light at the end of the tunnel. The Westmoreland who said to us, the enemy is on the run. He was right. They were on the run. At us, not away from us. I sat and watched this with despair, as I'm sure you did, as so many other Americans have, and said to myself, something must be done about it. We must, as citizens, stand up and say, so far and no further. It is wrong. It is wrong from beginning to end. It is illegal, as I've described to you. It is immoral for a great country like America to be beating up on a small country. It is un-American for us to support what was essentially a colonial war and now to impose our own will upon another nation 10,000 miles away, virtually without a major ally in the world, with the world criticizing us, with our prestige and our honor seriously stained. This is where we have come today. What can we do about it? I'm sure you're going to ask many questions of me, like how can we get out? And will there be a bloodbath? I've heard these questions before, and I'll try to answer them. But I'd like to conclude now on this point of where we are today by asking you to dedicate with me the meeting that we're having to a slogan that all of you know very well, that all of us and our children have been reared on. Our country, right or wrong. It is not a full quotation, and very few Americans know the full quotation, or who said it, or under what circumstance it was said. The full quotation is very beautiful and very noble. I'll tell you who said this and where, and it is so appropriate to dedicate our meeting to it. A great patriot, Carl Schurz, here in Chicago in 1899 at the Anti-Imperialist Congress, in which the greatest leaders and writers of America, the poets, and the intellectual elite of our country arose to denounce the Spanish-American War and the beginning of American imperialism, to denounce manifest destiny and all of the follies that were laying ahead. And Carl Schurz in Chicago at the Anti-Imperialist Congress said this, the full quote, which I give to you in conclusion of this meeting, and to which I hope we will all dedicate the meeting and what comes after this meeting in our own lives as citizens. Our country, right or wrong, when right, let us keep it right. When wrong, to be